if you can just answer this simply and straight about the Israeli closure of Al Jazeera. What is your response?
So we have seen the announcement from the government of Israel about closing Al Jazeera. We have made quite clear that we support media freedom all around the world, including in Israel, and that we are quite concerned about this action.
You're quite concerned about this action? Are you asking the Israelis to do anything?
So as the president said on May 3rd, journalists and media workers are an essential part of any democracy because informed dissent is critical to building stronger and more successful societies, and we will continue to support and advocate for free and independent media around the world. We think Al Jazeera ought to be able to operate in Israel as they operate in other countries in the region.
So you oppose?
We do.
You oppose?
We do.
Okay. All right. Then getting on to, so you've seen these reports in the last hour about Hamas accepting a ceasefire, but also the Israelis ordering or telling people in Rafa to get out. What's your take on that?
So I can confirm that Hamas has issued a response. We are reviewing that response now and discussing it with our partners in the region. As you know, Director Burns is in the region working on this in real time. We will be discussing this response with our partners over the coming hours. We continue to believe that a hostage deal is in the best interests of the Israeli people. It's in the best interests of the Palestinian people. It would bring an immediate ceasefire. It would allow increased movement of humanitarian assistance, and so we're going to continue to work to try to reach one.
And so, but you haven't made any determination about whether this is whether they're accepting what is on the table or they're accepting something that is different.
We have only received the response in the last hour, 90 minutes, and as I said, are going through it now and discussing it with partners in the region. So I don't want to characterize the nature of that response just yet.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Shannon.
Can I follow up on Al Jazeera?
Wait, Shannon, go ahead.
Thank you. There have been some reports that from Israel that perhaps Hamas agreed to a proposal that was put together by Egypt and Qatar that was softer than the initial framework that was in the works last week. Is it possible that there has been a different proposal that the U.S. is not involved with tracking?
So I've seen those suggestions. I've seen some of those reports, and I hope you'll understand that because we are still reviewing the response that has come in, and because we are working on this in real time and trying to reach an agreement, I'm just going to decline to comment on detail about any of those reports. We're going to be discussing this response with our partners in the region in the hours ahead. It remains our top priority to try to reach a ceasefire agreement that will lead to the release of hostages, that will allow a surge of humanitarian assistance both into Gaza and allow it to move around inside Gaza. But I don't want to comment on any of the various reports about what they might have been responding to until we've been able to go through it in detail and come to a full understanding and discuss it with our partners.
And can you say at this point, maybe you can't, but Hamas's political wing and their militant wing, are they on the same page here? Do you feel like this is a response that at least indicates where the entire group is?
I'm just not going to speak for Hamas at all. As we have said for some time, there has been a significant offer on the table. The ball has been in Hamas's court. We have made clear that they should accept that offer, that Israel made significant compromises, showed that they wanted to reach an agreement that would lead to the release of hostages, that would bring an immediate ceasefire, and we have hoped that Hamas would take the deal that was on the table. Now, as to what's in their response, what it looks like, we're going to review that and withhold judgment until we've had a chance to conduct a full review.
Can I ask about the threatened Israeli offensive in Rafa? In the hours before this, there are lots of reports about evacuations, not just reports, but Israel is talking about evacuations from Rafah. How does this? What's the U.S. message in this now? Do you think that Israel should hold off on any operations in Rafah as we discuss this response?
Of course we do. We've made quite clear our position on Rafah for some time, which is that we cannot support an operation in Rafah as it is currently envisioned. We have made clear, the Secretary made this clear in his conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other members of the Israeli government last week, that we have not seen a humanitarian plan that is credible and that is implementable. And we believe a military operation in Rafah right now would dramatically increase the suffering of of the Palestinian people would lead to an increase in loss of civilian life, would dramatically disrupt the delivery of humanitarian assistance, all of which is coming through, I shouldn't say all, but the great majority of which is coming through Karm Shalom or Rafa and is being distributed inside the Rafa area. If you think about what it would do when you have people moving north to places where internal distribution lines are not currently set up, and you're going to have to try to reestablish those in the middle of conflict in Rafa, we think that would be very difficult, if not impossible to do. So even absent this latest response, we have made clear that we do not support Israel launching a full-scale military operation in Rafa.
Sure. I mean, you just said it in terms of that's the standing U.S. position on this, but has there been any communication with the Israelis about, I mean, in the past hours or so, about the response from Hamas and how this affects the situation in Rafa? Is there a message?
I'm just not going to get into our those conversations. As I said, we just literally in the past hour, 90 minutes, received that response from Hamas in the first place. Of course, we will be discussing it with Egypt, with Qatar, with Israel, the three countries with whom we have been working throughout this negotiation process. But I don't want to get into the timing of those. But obviously, if those conversations have not already started, they will be ongoing in the next several hours. Mara.
Matt, under the current circumstances, do you still think a ceasefire is achievable based on what you know coming here?
What do you mean? Is a ceasefire achievable?
Like
a ceasefire is what we are trying to achieve.
Yes, but I mean, over the weekend there was a quiet impasse, and right now Hamas has accepted it. But from Israel, we're hearing that that's not the proposal that we've sent. That's a softened version that throws into the whole thing into doubt.
And I think
I'm just wondering, what's your sense?
A ceasefire is absolutely achievable. There has been a deal on the table, a proposal on the table that would achieve an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. Now, as for Hamas's response, which I think gets to your question, again, I don't want to characterize it in any sort of detail until we've had a chance to review it in depth and talk with our partners in the region about it.
And one thing on the humanitarian aid, last week when Secretary was in Israel, there was an increased emphasis during his trip on the delivery of humanitarian aid. We visited Karm Shalom, which got shut down over the weekend after the Hamas attack. But can you give us a sense of what a Rafa offensive, how that would impact all of Gaza? Because there are issues with distribution in the north. If we have a Rafa offensive in the south, could there be any meaningful humanitarian aid delivery in the north?
So let me just speak broadly to all of Gaza first, and then I'll come to the north. So certainly a Rafa operation would make it incredibly difficult to sustain the increases in humanitarian assistance that we have been able to deliver over the past few weeks since the president's call with Prime Minister Netanyahu on April 4th. You have seen an increase in the number of trucks going in through Karm Shalom. You have seen an increase in the distribution inside of Gaza, including inside southern Gaza. All of that would be put in jeopardy by a Rafa offensive because obviously, just look at what happened in the past 24 hours when you saw Hamas rocket attacks on Karm Shalom that led to the death of 3 IDF soldiers and led to the closure of Karm Shalom. If you had an ongoing kinetic military operation, it doesn't take a genius to figure out the impact that would have on the delivery of humanitarian assistance, not just through Karm Shalom, not just through Rafa Gate, but of course inside all of Rafa and all of southern Gaza. Now, separate from that, we have been working on standing up additional delivery mechanisms to get aid directly into northern Gaza without having to go through Karm Shalom. Not because we anticipated an upcoming Rafa operation, but because it's so difficult to get aid through Karm Shalom and then move it all the way to the north of Gaza. So that's why you saw the opening of Erez Crossing, which is something that the president insisted on and something that we achieved last week when the secretary was there first in Jordan and then in Israel. So you can have trucks move directly from Jordan through Erez Crossing in the north, not have to go all the way to Karm Shalom, come back up north. You saw Ashdod port opening, so goods can come directly from Ashdod and go in through a northern crossing, and it's why we're standing up the maritime operation. So there will be ways to get humanitarian assistance into northern Gaza directly. We have been working on those because it's important to do so, because we've seen how difficult it is to get aid from southern Gaza into northern Gaza. It's hard to speculate what the impact of a Rafa operation would have on the delivery of that aid to northern Gaza, but certainly you can say without a doubt that it would dramatically impact the delivery of humanitarian assistance in southern Gaza.
Just going off of that for a second, you said earlier, reiterated that the U.S. doesn't support a full-scale invasion into Rafah. What about a limited invasion into Rafah?
So I'm not going to speculate on the types of military operation.
It's not speculating. The Israeli government has said limited.
I'm about to answer, Kylie. So there are proposals that we have put on the table, and this is why I'm not going to talk about some of this publicly. There are proposals that we have put on the table to the Israeli government that we have discussed with them that we think would be a much more limited, much more targeted, much more effective way of achieving their legitimate military objectives, which is taking on the Hamas battalions that are remaining in Rafah. Those look very different than the types of operations that we have seen proposed publicly by the Israeli government, and I think I'll leave it at that.
So just to be clear, what you've proposed to them isn't your understanding of what they're planning to go ahead with in the near future?
I'm not going to speak to what they might be planning to go ahead with. I'll let them speak to that. We've seen the announcement they made today about evacuation orders for not entire southern Gaza, not the entire Rafah area, but for a significant portion of it, 100,000 people. And of course, we have concerns that any evacuation at all in such a crowded area, if you see 100,000 people move, you're going to see other people in the next area move as well, which of course is something that you want to see happen if there's a military operation. But the problem now is there's such limited places for them to go inside Gaza, and there is no effective way to distribute aid to them and make sure they have access to shelter, access to sanitation in the places that they would go if, say, you had hundreds of thousands of people moving from Rafah.
And then, without characterizing the Hamas response, given you guys are still reviewing it, would you say it's a hopeful sign that they have given a response here?
I think that would be characterizing it, so I'm going to decline to do so until we have completed that review.
And when do you think you'll be able to complete that review? When should we expect an assessment from the administration?
The Director Burns, as I said, is in the region literally working on this right now. I don't want to put a timetable on it, but it is something that is a top priority for everyone in this administration, from the president on down. You saw that the president had a phone call with Prime Minister Netanyahu today. Achieving a ceasefire deal that would lead to the release of hostages was one of the top priorities of the Secretary's trip when he was in the region last week. So everyone is focused on this. Everyone is trying to get a deal over the line.
Thank you. Last week there was some reporting that the Biden administration had put a hold on a shipment of US-made ammunition to Israel. Have you seen that report? Can you comment on its accuracy?
I have seen on that report. As is usually the case, we don't comment on specific cases of arms transfers, and I'm not going to do so here.
Thank you.
Yeah, Saeed.
Just to clarify on the offer that you said was generous and on the table and what seems to be accepted now. Does that mean that the ball is no longer in Hamas's court?
Saeed, it's impossible for me to answer that question without characterizing the response that Hamas has given, which I'm not yet willing to do.
Okay, all right. On Al Jazeera, now we know that Israel is accusing the correspondents of Al Jazeera, our colleagues, who are Israeli citizens, by the way, accusing them of incitement that goes back many years and all these things, a crime that is punishable by imprisonment. Are you worried that these correspondents might actually be imprisoned by the Israelis? And if they are, what would the government of the United States do?
So I'm not going to speak to those specific allegations. It's not something that we've reviewed in detail. We would have to do that. I'm certainly not going to speculate about what we might do in response to an action that has not yet been taken. I will just reiterate that when it comes to the decision to shutter Al Jazeera's operations in Israel, it's something that we are concerned by. We support the work that journalists and media do. We have had, I don't think it's any secret that we have had our differences with with Al Jazeera over the years, including some of the ways in which they cover this conflict. But we support the free media conducting their operations everywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think most countries have had an issue with Al Jazeera. Let me ask you about Rafa. Now, the movement, 100,000 people and so on. Now, how many would need to move before Israel can go in and legitimately go after Hamas's position? I mean, the area is so small, Al-Mawasi, where they are moving and so on, just meters, maybe kilometers away. What would prevent, let's say, Hamas fighters or Hamas leaders and so on to actually move, to another place? They allegedly have a network of tunnels that would allow them to do that, and so on. And then, we have the same kind of situation. We see the Israelis saying we want to go after them in that area. I mean, how do you read this whole situation?
So that is not really a question I can answer. I will just make clear, as I have already, and as others in the administration, including the president, including the secretary, have on a number of occasions, that a major operation in Rafa is not something that we can support.
Yeah. And finally, I asked on Thursday about Dr. Adnan al-Bursh. I was wrong. He wasn't shot. He died, and some say under torture and so on. I know that your colleague at the White House said what she said, that she was saddened and all these things. But have you followed up on this issue? How do you follow up on it? And because apparently they are keeping his corpse. I mean, they're not turning it to his family or others and so on for proper burial.
It is one that we have raised with the government of Israel. I don't have a response to read out. We have made clear with Israel, as we have made clear publicly, that they must treat all detainees humanely and with dignity in accordance with international humanitarian law, and that they must respect detainees' human rights, and also that they must ensure accountability for any abuses or violations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Matt. Since they took all the Al Jazeera questions, I'll skip mine.
No problem.
I just want to...
Alex, did you have something?
No.
Just kidding.
I just want to, because I'm a little bit confused, if you can clarify. So the Hamas response is not on the general's proposal. It's not accepting this proposal.
I think I made clear I'm not going to characterize their response one way or the other until we've had a chance to fully review it, digest it, discuss it with our partners.
All right. My second question is about the peer that the United States is conducting. We believe we have in our reporting that it is close to being operational. Can you just tell us how this peer will operate? I mean, who will have the upper hand in making this?
So it is something that we have been trying to complete as soon as possible. And when I say we, I mean largely our colleagues at the Pentagon who are constructing the pier. We've been involved in liaising with humanitarian groups that will be involved in the distribution of humanitarian assistance once it comes in to Gaza. But with the actual timeline for the launch of the pier and its operation, any details, I'm going to defer to the Pentagon to comment on those in any detail.
By the way, on the pier itself, it was said over the weekend that it was moved to Ashdod because of some high winds and waves and so on. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm going to defer to the Pentagon for any of those operational kind of details. They're the ones that are responsible for constructing and moving it and ultimately launching it. Michelle, go ahead. Do a few more in the Middle East before.
Did you ask Qatar to expel Hamas leaders from Doha, and is it the time for these leaders to leave?
I am not going to speak to private diplomatic conversations. As we have said a number of times, the Secretary in his conversations has made clear with a number of partners in the region that any relationship they have with Hamas, any influence they have with Hamas, they should use to make clear to Hamas that it needs to accept a ceasefire deal that includes the release of hostages. And he has also made clear publicly that at the end of this process, there can no longer be business as usual with Hamas as existed in too many places before October 7th. And I think I'll decline to comment any further.
Thank you.
Any more in the region? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. For World Press Freedom Day last week, the Secretary did put out a statement about that. I'm just curious as to why there was a decision not to mention the Gaza war. Granted that many journalists are being affected by a lack of press freedom around the world and also being killed in various conflicts, but there was a substantial number of journalists that were killed in Israel and Gaza at the end of last year. Was there a reason why that wasn't mentioned?
No, the Secretary has spoken to that a number of times, including in the region, including speaking directly to the colleagues of journalists in some instances who have lost their life tragically. We mourn the death of every journalist. You've heard the Secretary speak to the fact that it is because of journalists in Gaza that we see what's happening, that the world knows what's happening. And so we support their work. We want to see it continued. And we mourn the loss of every journalist, and have spoken to that many times since the outbreak of this conflict.
Thank you.
Just
Yeah.
one more on it, just on Karm Shalom.
Yeah.
Is it your understanding that the Israelis have agreed to reopen it after the attack that happened on Sunday?
So yes, that was it. If you looked at the readout from the president's call, it noted that the prime minister had agreed to open it in that conversation.
Okay, because, the secretary was just there on Wednesday. And you believe that Karm Shalom is critical,
It is-
with or without a Rafa
It is.
operation.
Karm Shalom is absolutely critical to the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, especially in southern Gaza. Now that we've stood up operations in the
So
north,
is it
But,
open now, do you know?
I do not know if it's been reopened. I'll say it was an incredibly cynical act for Hamas to attack Karm Shalom yesterday, knowing that Karm Shalom is the linchpin to the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. It goes to this point we've made on a number of occasions that Hamas claims that they represent the interests of the Palestinian people, but when you see some of their actions, and we talk about them hiding behind humans, using them as human shields all the time, when you see them attacking the gate that serves as the delivery point, as we saw, you were there last week, as we saw with our own eyes, the delivery point for humanitarian assistance into Gaza, it really does undermine any claim that they have to acting on the people of Gaza's behalf.
Thanks.
Can I switch regions?
I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Matthew. What action would the U.S. take if Israel were to invade Rafa?
We have made clear that we cannot support an operation, and I don't want to speculate on what actions we might take if one should proceed.
Okay, and what's the department's reaction to Turkey suspending trade ties with Israel?
I don't have any comment on that. They are both allies of ours, and we would encourage them to work through their differences, but I don't have any specific comment.
And finally, what is the department doing to hold the CCP accountable for continued Chinese assistance to Russia's defense sector?
So you heard the secretary speak to this when he was in China and made clear that China can't have it both ways. They can't claim to be a partner of Europe on the one hand and then continue to fund the greatest threat to European security since the end of the Cold War. On the other hand, he raised this directly with President Xi. He raised it with Director and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and he made clear in those meetings that if China didn't act, we would. And a couple of updates to that. You saw us roll out additional sanctions on Chinese entities who have supported Russia's defense industrial base last week. And then I want to note that we made clear that it is not just the United States that is concerned about China's activities, but it is also our partners and allies in Europe. And, President Xi is in Europe today, meeting with President Macron, meeting with the president of the EU. And if you noted the comments from the government of France, they very much intended to press this same case with President Xi and make clear what a threat they see it the way we see it, which is that it is a threat not just to Ukraine, but it is a threat to European security. And we think it's important that our allies and partners stand strong in sending that message as well.
And just one more.
Yeah.
What is the department's message today, given it's Yom HaShoah, Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day, especially with Israel having suffered several months ago the largest single-day massacre of Jews since the Holocaust? And I know the secretary.
The secretary put out a statement on that yesterday where he reiterated what has been our continuing message, which is never again. And I think you'll see this president speak to this further.
Matt, can I piggyback off?
He would go ahead.
Matt, you said you made a
Thank you.
for a more limited operation in Rafah, and you're working on a ceasefire with your partners. What comes first? I mean, you share the objective, you said, with the Israeli that they have to defeat Hamas in Rafah. But since you are working on a ceasefire, it's a little bit confusing. What you support, what's the priority here?
Our immediate objective is to achieve a ceasefire that alleviates the suffering of Palestinian people, that secures the release of hostages. And then we want to build that ceasefire, as we have made clear, into something more sustained and something longer lasting. I'm a little bit of a bind here because I can't really speak to the options that we have proposed to Israel. You can see why we would want to keep those confidential, but we have proposed options that we believe are more effective and would be more effective in dealing with the threat that Hamas poses, and those are options that they could pursue, and I think I'll leave it. Unfortunately, I have to leave it at that.
One more question. In case these negotiations fail, are you preparing for a worst-case scenario that the Israeli goes into Rafah, and this lasts until the fall?
Of course, we are prepared for every scenario, but I don't think I wanted to read out what actions we might take.